Okay, the popcorn bag is starting to pop a little slower now as participant numbers is almost stabilizing. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Medema with the Charter School Facility Center at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Today we have a webinar on renegotiating leases in the time of COVID-19. This is the third in a series of COVID-19 webinars that we've had. The first was on construction.
Mark?
Yes? This is the third in a series. This webinar is being recorded. And please, if you have any questions, use the chat box. If you have any or questions for the panelists afterwards, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Today, Sarah Batterton will be moderating the panel, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce the panelists and begin the webinar. I'll just double check and make sure that Sarah can hear me. I'm getting one of those looks on a Zoom screen that you're not sure what you should do with. No, all of our trial times still seems to have resulted in a dead spot here. Well, maybe I'll say hello. Lisa DeSfosse, are you available?
I can jump in.
And Lisa,
let me just.
Can you hear too?
I can hear too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we just lost.
All right.
With Sarah.
That's okay. So let me jump in. Let's see if we can get Sarah to switch the slides. Maybe if one of you could chat to Sarah and just ask her to switch the slides. And in the meantime, I can just keep on going. So what we want to do is, the first thing we want to do is just review the objectives for the day. And these will come up as soon as we get Sarah back in motion. The first objective is we want to make sure that we're giving school leaders some key considerations involved within COVID-19 lease renegotiations. This is actually a really interesting time right now. And there are, just a ton of uncertainties out there in the marketplace and trying to figure out what charter schools can do in the face of all of this uncertainty. And so we've been working with a bunch of different organizations on renegotiating their leases and thinking through how they might approach that. And we wanted to share some of that insight and information with you and considerations. The second thing we wanted to do is we've assembled some key levers that could be helpful as you think about how to influence or support those lease negotiations, and things that you could offer, things that you could ask for if you feel like there are concessions that could be gained. The last thing we wanted to do is to share a few common lease scenarios that we've been encountering and talk about a few different entry points to kind of start negotiations and prepare for those negotiations. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to leave time for a question and answer. We want to leave significant time for question and answer because we feel like that is sometimes where some of the meatiest conversation happens. So just to keep moving forward to the next slide about the panelists. Sarah, are you back? Can't tell if she's back. I would let her take over if she's back. But we'll start with a description of the panelists. Sarah is an independent consultant. She's the former acting COO and VP of Real Estate and Facilities for Uncommon Schools. I am an owner of I+D Consulting, which works with charter schools on their real estate and finance strategy. I'm currently the interim CFO for Neighborhood House Charter School up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and the former deputy CFO and VP of Facilities and Capital Financing for Team of First, which is in Brooklyn, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And Lisa Holtzmuller is of counsel with Barton and Gilman, and she does a ton of real estate law for charter schools across the country. Sarah, are you back? Would you like to, actually, this is Lisa Holtzmiller. I'm going to turn it over to, this is Sarah. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah if she's back, but otherwise I'll keep going. Okay. All right, so we'll keep going. The rationale for renegotiation, we really wanted to land on, you know, when you are thinking about renegotiating, what are the different things that you would think about, and when might you approach a school, a landlord, and talk about renegotiating a lease? And before you do renegotiate and approach the landlord, we wanted to share with you some things that you could think about to evaluate both your financial position and the potential of, you know, is your negotiation likely to go well? First, think about the financial uncertainties. There's a lot of charter schools right now that are anticipating revenue declines, either in this fiscal year. There are some states in this fiscal year that cut finances in the fourth quarter of this fiscal year, but also revenue declines associated with enrollment and lower enrollment. There's a lot of kids who have been uprooted to go stay with families, or, you know, or just move away. And then they've also looking at donor limitations as a significant revenue decline, either in this quarter or anticipated for next year. Sarah, are you back?
I'm here. Sorry about that.
You want to take over? That's okay. I saw you. Do you want to take over to continue talking about financial uncertainties?
Yes, great. Apologies for the unexpected technical difficulty.
No worries.
So excited to have everyone here today, and really understand that everyone on this call is facing significant financial uncertainties, as Lisa outlined. What we hope to do as we launch into this conversation today is to give you some anchoring questions to help inform your negotiation strategy, and to help you decide if, when, and how you might decide to pursue a renegotiation of your lease. The 5 questions that really came to mind for the 3 of us were, is your school or lease currently in good standing or at risk of default? And knowing where you stand and what your position is in that will help inform your path forward. Does your school have a legal basis to renegotiate? Understanding if the current terms of your lease offer a legal basis to do so will certainly strengthen your position and entering conversations. Does your school have a business or economic argument to renegotiate? And if so, is it grounded in kind of evidence and fact, or mostly in worry and uncertainty? Both are valid, but it will certainly help you chart the conversations differently. Have you previously negotiated any construction timelines within your lease that have been impacted by the COVID-19 environment? And what other factors might strengthen your negotiation position? Your commitment to social or racial justice, or other service offerings that you might provide to the community, be it as a center for food service and support, or elsewise. So we hope those are some grounding questions around which you can engage with the subsequent slides and conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Holtzmiller to take us through some factors to consider before you begin.
Thanks, Sarah. And yes, you touched upon some of these in the last slide, but there are things that are very landlord specific or property specific or lease specific that you need to think about, including the relationship you have with your landlord profile. So are you dealing with a not-for-profit landlord, a church, the church, or a commercial landlord who owns many buildings, not just the one that you're in? The number of tenants in the facility, do you occupy the entire building, or are there other tenants, 4, 5, 10, 20 in the building that you're in? How long is your lease? Is it a short-term lease versus a 10, 20, 30-year lease? Whether your lease profile, so is it a triple net lease versus owner managed? What responsibilities does the tenant versus the landlord have in that lease? Escalation clauses, meaning what does your rent structure look like? Is the rent going to be staying steady, or is it going up this year, next year, in the next few months? And keeping in mind specific clauses in your lease that may be relevant. So something that we see sometimes are building and school closure clauses. Sometimes that can actually be an event of default. So keep an eye out for certain things in your lease that are actually touched upon by the COVID-19 crisis. And then
Lisa,
yeah.
can I interject and maybe ask you to touch on an interesting question? You mentioned the importance of really knowing your landlord and understanding their interests and positions before sort of diving into negotiation. What advice might you offer to the audience if they don't really have direct contact with their landlord? You know, if their primary engagement is through a broker or an attorney, you know, or there's been a sort of a change in the guard of, you know, who their relationship contact is.
Right, sure. That's a good question. I mean, definitely leverage any relationships you do have. So if your broker has a relationship with a landlord's broker, leverage that. If the attorneys had a good relationship during negotiation, try to use that. And if you really don't have any sort of insight into your landlord, try to work on understanding their profile a little bit more. So is this a small time landlord, or do they have a lot of buildings? What are the, you know, is their building vacant? Focus more on the other items that you can ascertain. And something to think about just for schools in non-COVID-19 times and right now is try to build that relationship with your landlord, even if they are a big landlord. Some of the most successful relationships I've seen has been from, you know, a commercial landlord buying into the mission of the school. And then when things like this come up unexpectedly, you can kind of fall back on that. So it's something to, maybe if you don't have a relationship, you start building one now.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you for sharing those insights.
Okay. So then other than the lease specific items, you have industry factors and external factors that play a part in this. So look to see whether your business interruption insurance will cover any losses. My experience with the clients that I work with is the answer to that is no, but that could be dependent on your insurance carrier. So talk to your broker and carrier on that question. But unfortunately, that hasn't helped most schools that I work with. Force majeure clauses. Look at your lease to see whether you have a force majeure clause, and what that is it basically excuses both parties or one party's non-performance of certain obligations in the lease if an uncontrollable event occurs. And typically those events are listed out. So you see an earthquake or union labor strikes. Whether a pandemic is listed is, I would say, probably less likely, but there may be a governmental shutdown listed, or there could be something else to rely on that. And that will give you a legal, if there is something about a force majeure excusing your performance, that may give you a legal basis for approaching your landlord. Whether or not you rely on that or go to litigation, I think that's probably go to court over it. I think it's unlikely, but it can at least give you some leverage. And if you don't have a force majeure clause in your lease, you're out of luck on that one, but you could rely on what's more of a common law doctrine, which is the impossibility of performance or frustration of performance. And so basically you can say that when you entered into the lease, something happened, an external event happened that basically makes the performance of the lease impossible. And again, I think this may be a difficult win if you were to take it all the way to court, but it can open the door to conversations. And certainly tenants have been, bringing this up when talking to landlords about renegotiating their leases. State and local commercial rent forbearance. I mean, from what I've seen, a lot of this is residential based, but there could be some states that have commercial rent forbearance, and then state and local closure requirements and durations. So again, I touched upon that on the force majeure, but whether your state is forcing you to close down your school, or whether you're doing it voluntarily because you can't make it work, or you don't want to make it work at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. If you could change to the next slide.
And here are some key levers to support renegotiation. So think about these are things that you can basically be asking for, and what we've seen schools ask for: payment abatement, so rent abatement. You're not going to pay rent for a certain amount of time. Payment reduction, so your base rent is reduced for the period of time that maybe you're not occupying the building, or that you're only occupying a portion of the building. Rent deferral. So this is a common one that I've been seeing, is you're not paying rent during this crisis, and maybe you're expecting your per pupil to go down so much in the next year that you're not going to be able to make your payments, but you can renegotiate to basically add on any base rent that you're not paying in the next year to a later point down the line in the term. And this is definitely can be used with longer term leases, or a combination of the above. Also, something to think about is whether you want to collaborate to reduce property expenses. So if you're not using the building, think about what you can do. Either this may or may not be in your lease, but do you need all of the lights on? Do you need your HVAC running? That will really depend on whether how many tenants are in the building and what your landlord's role is. But I think that there's definitely a way to reduce some of those expenses right now. And then lastly is property tax abatement. It's very unclear what this crisis will end up doing to the real estate markets. And I'm sure every state and every city is a little bit different, but if your property value does go way down, think about and don't forget about perhaps looking at a property tax abatement if your school is responsible under the lease for paying property taxes. And the biggest takeaway I would say is think about what your landlord, think of this as a two-way street, and what can you give your landlord that they would want in order to get something that you need. So if you need a payment deferral, perhaps you add in, one thing I saw was adding in 6 months to the end of the term. So, or you can add interest to any deferred amount. So think about, you don't have to offer that right away, but I think it's important to remember you may need to give something in order to get something from your landlord.
Okay, thanks Lisa for walking us through that. Lisa D, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. One of the things we were hoping to do today is to share with you 5 common scenarios and potential approaches. All of us are pretty practical people, and I think sometimes having practical scenarios to talk through and real examples can give ideas that, just talking theoretically may not be able to do. So we put together 5 scenarios that we are, either actively working on or have seen or, can imagine are at play. And just wanted to walk through them with you to hopefully give you ideas about how you might make your approach with the landlord if you're considering one. The first is there are some schools who have their rent tied to annual per pupil funding. And if a charter is expecting a decrease in per pupil funding over the next year, then there's a question of how do you approach the landlord and let them know about this? It's potentially good news, but there are some things to think about as you think about the approach. The first is to look at your lease and see if there's a floor, because some leases are written where the rent is tied to per pupil funding. So if you get a 6% increase, then the lease might, the lease payment might go up 6% increase. Some of them have a floor that say, but it can never go down. And so you want to look at your lease to see if there is that floor, or if there's the potential for your lease payment to go down if it's tied to per pupil funding. The other question to think about here is what is the mechanism that you have to notify your landlord of the new per pupil funding and then start to make the new payment. And it's a little tricky in this situation because a lot of states haven't and are going to have a very delayed budget approval process. And so the question is, some of the states that I'm working with are approving budgets on a month-to-month basis. And so what communication do you need to have with your landlord now to basically say, hey, this is the situation that we're anticipating. We anticipate that we won't know what rent we're paying you until, a certain time in the month, or we're anticipating a decrease. We wanted to make you aware of that so that they know. And then, you may want to communicate now and then say, we'll send formal documentation as soon as we have it, but it really depends on what the mechanism is in the lease for you notifying them about the per pupil funding. The second situation that seems to be one of the most common is schools that have a rent that's predetermined with a built-in annual escalation. So for example, if you're paying rent and then every year your rent increases by 1.5% or 2% every year. But the problem is that if your per pupil funding is uncertain or is expected to decline, you have a potential issue where your rent is going to increase, but your funding is either going to stay flat or decrease. And the question is, like, how do you manage that, right? What conversations do you approach with the landlord? In the case of a school that I'm working on, they really don't have a legal leg to stand on from the fact that, the increases are within their lease. And if they were to not pay those increases, they would be in default of their lease. They don't have a very strong force majeure clause. But they are still asking for financial accommodations. And the way that they're asking for it is they're saying, we want to stay here in the long term, but we need some help in the short term. And so there's a few different things you could ask for here. First is you could ask for a one-time exception to the rent escalation and just say, look, like obviously we agreed to the rent escalation. No one expected a global pandemic. Could we please have a 1-year stay? And so this year, can we just pay a flat rate and then we'll pick it up again next year? The landlord isn't obligated to say yes to that, but they have an interest in keeping the space occupied and they don't want a tenant who's in default. And so they might say yes, it might be worth a question. You could also ask for flexibility in when you make the payments this year and allow for a delay in payments without triggering the default provision. So a lot of times if you pay late, it can trigger a default provision. And so you could ask ahead of time and say, like, can we ask for the ability to pay late over this next year without triggering the default provision? The third thing that you can do, Lisa Holtzmiller mentioned this already, is you could ask for some help on the CAM expenses. Either some relief from CAM expenses this year, again, like a one-time relief in CAM expenses, or ask for collaboration with the landlord to work on decreasing them for this year, especially if there's going to be lower occupancy in the building for at least part of the year. So those are some potential approaches for the second scenario. On the third, if you have rent with escalations that are based on CPI, which is a consumer price index, or other indices, a lot of times the way this works is every, let's say, 5 years, the rent resets based on, whatever growth there has been on the consumer price index. And so if you have a rent that's structured like this, there's a few important things to think about. It could be good news, but it really depends on when your CPI index reset happens and where you are in that cycle. For example, if it happens every 5 years and you're in year 2, it's not going to help you right now. But if you're in year 5, it potentially could. So the first question is to go back and look and see where are you in that cycle, and then read the lease and see how it's calculated. And honestly, I would go and do the calculation myself to see where it's going to land and what I want to ask for from the landlord. Your calculation, even if it's not perfect, it'll be close. And then you could go and figure out what you want to ask for from the landlord. On the fourth scenario, there's a few situations that I've seen and one that I'm working with where the organization is paying rent to a developer and then they have a lease buyout window that's coming. So, in the coming 6 months, their window opens and they have an opportunity to buy out the property from the developer. And the key is you only have a certain window for this buyout. And if you don't act within that window, you lose the opportunity and then you've got to pay rent for the next umpteen years. And so you really don't want to miss the window, but it's a really hard time for charter schools to make that commitment right now. So there's a couple things to think about. One is, can you do it, right? I mean, take a look at your cash situation. Is it riskier than it once was if your enrollment is uncertain? Are there other organizational priorities that your school is focused on right now? Like, are you working still on the transition to remote learning? Are you trying to figure out what is going to happen in the fall and what that's going to look like? Is it just really hard for the organization to get it done during the buyout window? And if that's true, then you could certainly go to the developer and ask to amend the lease buyout window given the global pandemic. You could ask for a delayed window. You could ask to move it back by a year or two, or you could ask for an elongated window and just stretch it out so that you have more time in the window to give yourself more flexibility and to kind of handle the uncertainty that I think we're all seeing and feeling for the next 12 months. The last thing I'll say on this one is if there's other criteria that you have to meet in order to be eligible for the buyout, check those now. Because if any of those are in jeopardy, you should ask for relief from those criteria. So for example, if they have a certain enrollment requirement, you might want to ask for relief from that now if you aren't sure that you're going to hit it, because you don't want to jeopardize your lease buyout because of this pandemic situation. And I think proactive communication here with the developer will be really important.
And Lisa, it occurs to me that if your lease buyout window isn't already structured in some kind of an option format, then one way to achieve that longer term period without the kind of all-in costs of the lease buyout might be to propose an option structure.
Right.
As a,
definitely.
You know, some funds out of pocket, but not the whole hog.
Yeah. Right, exactly. It's a great point. The last thing to ask for, I'm working with one organization where they expect their per pupil to be steady or frankly increase a little bit next year due to the additional federal funds that are coming down for the district. And yet they are still struggling because they are anticipating greater facility needs for next year to separate the students to be at least 6 feet apart. And they're expecting some additional costs for technology and remote learning for next year. And what they've done is they've actually gone and asked their landlord for CAM help. And you know, CAM is common area expenses that you share with the other tenants in the building. And so what they've done is they've sat down with a landlord and kind of gone through each itemized CAM cost and asked if there are ways to reduce them, even just in the short term over the summer. But they successfully worked on, they asked the landlord to go and talk to their property insurance broker and ask for a decrease in their property liability insurance. Since there are so many fewer people on the property, they feel like the risk for their property insurance is a lot lower. And they've asked their landlord to try and go back and renegotiate that price that then is passed through on the CAM charges. They've also asked for the settings on the air conditioning and the heat to be changed because they feel like the building doesn't need to be fully air conditioned or fully heated during this year if there aren't going to be students in the building. They've asked for the elimination of security guards in common spaces when, you know, the number of people in the building is far fewer. And they've also asked to reduce the cleaning of common areas because the traffic is far less. And so those are areas that they feel like, especially over the summer, they could ask for, you know, reduced costs there, and that it would turn into savings that the school could translate into their instructional program this year.
Great, thank you, Lisa.
And I guess I just want to make one last point that landlords, I think right now really are incentivized to make small concessions because they don't want a vacant property, and the commercial property industry is in trouble right now with so many businesses struggling. And so this is a good opportunity to talk to your landlord for concessions because they don't want a vacant property.
And I think it's also a good opportunity to highlight actually the stability of your tenancy in the context of kind of an unstable market. You know, schools in this period of time actually offer, even despite potential per pupil revenue declines, more stable, reliable revenue source than retail or commercial tenants. And so I think landlords know that, but it would help to remind them of that in the context of the negotiation.
Right, exactly. Great. Next slide.
We do have one question from the field here. What if you don't have another facility option? Sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's probably a little bit of a game of chicken going on here.
Yeah, I wonder if that participant is saying, you know, in terms of negotiating with the landlord, like if you really don't have, you know, any other option, you have to stay and you have to pay. I mean, that is the reality of it, right? That, you know, if there is a lease agreement, then you have to abide by the lease agreement unless there's another agreement or unless you're in default. And so I think, you know, what we're really focusing on here is like how to proactively go to the landlord and ask for stuff and offer stuff to see if there can be kind of a mutual amendment to that agreement reached. At the end of the day, if the landlord is unwilling to talk or unwilling to negotiate, you are stuck. I mean, you know, there is a contract in place if there's a lease in place.
I would just add to maybe, you know, just remembering the sort of core best practices of a negotiation strategy is sort of knowing your best alternative. And in this case, if there is no other facility, you know, really understanding if this financial impact is so significant that it would cause you to have to close. I mean, that is a worst case option that, you know, we never would want to occur. But if that is truly your reality, being able to name that for the landlord is really important. I mean, that might make the difference to them because it would mean loss of a tenant. Now, I would never recommend suggesting that if it's not truly the situation that you were in, but I think an important consideration.
That's a great point. The other thing is, I mean, I have been in situations where I have gone to the landlord with an open book and said, I want to show you what we're facing here. You know, this was our per pupil last year. This is our per pupil this year. This is how many students we have. And it is a revenue deficit now of this much money. And, you know, and I said, you can pull these numbers off of the state website. I'm not making these numbers up. You can verify them. Just to be able to demonstrate to them the impact, like the financial impact that is happening. And similarly, I mean, you could go to them and say, you know, here are additional cleaning costs we're expecting to incur because, you know, we're going to have to clean like all these surfaces so many more times a day. Here's the cost for the extra PPE we're buying. Here's the extra cost of technology that we're buying. Like these are all costs that we didn't anticipate. We're getting no more money from the state. You know, I'm being very open book with you, but I'm looking to kind of work together to solve this problem. But like this is our reality. And sometimes like if you come with that level of transparency on frankly information that's public information anyway, you know, it can sometimes help move the conversation to a productive place.
Lisa, I just want to add to that. I mean, on the conservative attorney side of me, I always get worried about going to a landlord and, you know, say the landlord, which I've had happen before, and the landlord saying, oh, okay, you're in default. Goodbye. You know, we want someone else in here anyway. We don't like you as a tenant. So, I mean, that goes back to knowing your landlord and knowing the relationship you have. And if you're on thin ice with your landlord and you're just asking for an abatement because it seems appropriate because times are tough, it may not be the right time for you. So really think about all of the factors.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. I hope we answered it. This is actually a perfect segue to talking about making the approach because, you know, to Sarah's point, like one of the basic tenets of negotiation is doing your homework ahead of time because negotiations really, really favor the prepared. And I love to be the most prepared person in the room for negotiations. It often works out in our favor. And so the first thing is know your landlord. You know, there's a big difference between how you would approach a nonprofit landlord versus a for-profit landlord. There's a big difference in approach if the landlord is related to you, you know, is an affiliated organization, or, you know, is a like-minded, you know, similar, you know, working in a similar mission organization, or if, you know, it's a pure, you know, business transaction for them. Similarly, it's different if it's a Fortune 500 company versus a family real estate business who's counting on this as their income today. So know your landlord and think about what they want, and both what their short-term interests are, but what their long-term interests are as well. You know, some of them might be motivated by some money today, and some might be motivated by, you know, making sure that you're not leaving the property in the next 5 years. And so, you know, that's a consideration. The second is know where you want to land. And this is where, you know, I start, you know, bringing up Excel and doing the calculations, and, you know, finding the CPI index and calculating what I think our rent would be, and coming up with like what my ideal is, but then also what's acceptable and what I would say yes to and why. And I would say also, you know, just making sure that then you get these numbers internal to your organization, whatever that process looks like. You kind of get buy-in into this too, so that when you're going into the negotiation, you already, you know, you don't have to do steps after the negotiation to get buy-in and approval internally, but you've kind of already gotten that conversation, you know, had ahead of time internally, so that when you go into the negotiation, there is consensus within your organization on where you want to land, but what you would settle for. The third is documentation and evidence. Look at your lease. I often have sections highlighted, so I'm ready to go with it. Look at state orders. Look at the dates that the state, you know, has mandated, you know, closure. Know what those dates are. Recognize that commercial landlords and nonprofit landlords, to some extent, are nervous and they feel on edge right now. And you are potentially a really steady tenant, and that can be a really strong advantage. Position your ask in a long-term context, like we're here to stay, but we need some short-term help. That can be a very good path to take here, but also like come up with the phrases that you want to make knowing your landlord, and just, you know, make sure to work those phrases into your communication with the landlord. The sixth thing is know what you're asking for, but also know where you can make concessions, right? If you're asking for the ability to make delayed payments this year, but you're willing to tack 1 year onto the end of your lease, that could be a pretty good deal for a landlord, especially understanding what's going on right now. So just know, you know, what you're willing to make in order to seem like it truly is a partnership, but you can get what you need this year. And then the last is be aware of any provisions that could impact your timing and approach. Like if you have to notify your landlord of a certain amount of time, you know, before you miss a payment in order to not be in default, make sure you're hitting those dates and make sure you know those dates really well. But similarly, at the end of a negotiation, once you've had it with them, make sure that you're documenting the result of that negotiation, whether it's through a lease amendment or whether it's through like another formal documentation. Because the last thing you want to do is come to an agreement and then be declared in default because there's no documentation of the agreement that you came into. So, so that's super, super, super important.
Thank you, Lisa. We are excited to turn it over to the audience for even more questions, and welcome you to begin sharing those questions in the Q&A chat box. But before, while we let those questions come in, Lisa D, I just wanted to ask for your thoughts on what you would recommend schools think about if they're approaching a lease renewal period and have about a 6 months from now might have to give notice, as you just mentioned, on notice provisions, all the while being highly uncertain about the kind of financial position that the school will be in a year from now. What advice would you give to schools navigating a situation like that, and how soon should schools start conversations with the landlord about revisiting the terms in that kind of a context?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess it won't surprise any of you to know that first I would sit down and like think about what we actually need as a school, and what opportunities are there to renegotiate right now. And then the second question is now the right time to renegotiate? So because there's two paths here. The first is you could use this time to your advantage and use it to renegotiate a lease with either lower payments or more flexibility in some way. But the other thing is, if you don't know what you need, the other thing that you could ask for is an extension on that time frame, and just say, you know, we would like additional time to plan for the renewal and that conversation. So internally, I guess the questions that I would be asking are, do we definitely want to renew this lease, or are there questions? And if we renew the lease, is it fine as is, or would we want adjustments to the lease? And kind of like writing out what those are and what impacts those would have on the budget. And then the third is, you know, is now the right time, or do we want to ask for an extension? Those are the things I would think about. And I wouldn't be afraid to go to the landlord and ask for what you want, but again, know what you would settle for.
Great. I see a number of good questions coming in through the chat box, and one of them is, do the panelists have any insights on what the trends are in commercial real estate? Would you say that commercial rents are generally down 5%? I'm happy to share some thoughts and perspectives on that, but other co-panelists, helpful to hear your thoughts, because I think it may depend on markets and not specific, not general nationally. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and was having a similar conversation with a broker yesterday. And, you know, general feedback was, you know, actual market rental rates are going to take some time, take a significant amount of time to change. I think that the context will probably be different depending on the landlord, and if they're a single site landlord or a sort of more commercial property landlord, and what the impact to them has been around their other tenants. And they may be willing to make shorter term concessions, you know, not knowing what the market ahead holds, but want to hold tighter on their sort of longer term assumptions. So Lisa H or Lisa D, curious if you have any thoughts to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am seeing significant shifts in the commercial market right now. There's a property that we're trying to buy for a charter school, and it had a commercial lease on it with a very big retail tenant who was paying $18 a square foot. That tenant left a year ago. They're now looking to release it. They just changed their number down this month to $12 a square foot. So that's an incredibly significant drop. The other is I also am working on a situation where there's a pretty significant retail tenant that we're looking at for a charter school, and it's a I don't want to say it's a big box store because it's not in a big box, but you know what I mean. And the retail store is opting not to renew its lease because they're closing stores in the Northeast. And as a result, the property is being given up by the land holding interest and is being turned over to the bank, basically in foreclosure. And so, you know, it's an exciting opportunity for the school because the property is suddenly available for sale and for potentially a really good deal. But I think, you know, it is an indication that I think is a very, very quickly changing commercial landscape right now. And I think that the commercial landholders are very concerned about what's going to happen in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Lisa. There's another question here from somebody asking about any specific issues to be addressed when seeking to negotiate with the Archdiocese. That's a really interesting question. I know many charters across the country lease space in former diocese school buildings. And speaking from experience, having done a lot of negotiation with the Archdiocese and also sort of following national trends on this, I think I can't think of any specific issues that come to mind as part of the negotiation, but I do think entering the conversation with a lot of empathy for the context and situation that they may be in now as well. I know that a lot of private and parochial schools are suffering significant enrollment declines, and often that is going to mean school closures, which is going to mean kind of impact to students and, you know, families, and, you know, many of them are serving populations not dissimilar from those your schools may be serving. So I think just, you know, acknowledging in some way that you know that context is there, and entering the negotiation sort of thoughtfully and with that in mind, to keep in mind that sort of key tip that we offered before is kind of what can you get from this negotiation, but also what can you give? They may be having some cash flow challenges of their own. Lisa, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I would just, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Sarah. And not to mention that church service has been suspended in many places and still is. And so they're not the parish itself who often drive some of the smaller points on these leases. While the arch kind of talks about rent, you know, figures out the rent, the parish itself sometimes drives more operational issues. And so to remember that they may be suffering is a really good point.
Great. I see two questions coming in around lease duration, and I'm wondering, Lisa H., if you could share some of your experience. One question is kind of what are the kind of average length of charter school leases to the extent you've seen typical lease terms? And the second one was if you were negotiating kind of a lease term renewal, what period of time might you kind of recommend be considered?
So I think this varies by state, because I know that there are some states that put restrictions on how long the authorizers put restrictions on how long your lease can be. But in the states that I work with, it varies from a year for like a short-term space to 30 or 30 plus years for long-term space. It depends on so many factors, whether you think you're going to do a build out, whether you need financing, you are going to need your lease term to be longer. And that may be, so if you're going to be building out space, you may want, you know, a 10-year term with a bunch of renewal terms in the tenant's sole discretion. So I think that's a hard question to answer in general, but with COVID, I think Lisa DeFostis had a really good point. If when renewing, or, you know, maybe it's better to have a short-term vision right now and get through the next year or two, and see how the landscape and your school needs change. I mean, hopefully we all go back to normal, but what happens if you actually need a lot more space because of social distancing to make your program work? I would just hate for anyone to enter into a 30-year lease for a building that's not going to work for them in 2 years when everything shakes out.
Mm-hmm. That's good reminder and good perspective. We're balancing the short term and the advantages of the short term with the needs of the long term. There's another question here around the best way to find the going rate for price per square foot for different markets. I share a few thoughts on that. You know, there's lots of different published and unpublished ways to collect that information. Typically, brokers are a good source of information for that kind of data. But I think helpful, given the rapidly shifting market dynamics, to not rely on a single broker for that information, and to really make sure that you're speaking with brokers that have experience in the market that serves schools, because many of them will say that, you know, the market is the market, but they're not right about that most of the time, and there are exceptions for particularly, as we've referenced a few times on this call, that, you know, there's a lot to be said for the stability that a school can offer, particularly in this real estate market, and there will be probably better rates offered for stability than for a tenant who, you know, has the potential to bring in more kind of revenue, but offers sort of a less stable tenancy. Lisa D, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think, starting with a broker is a good point. You don't have to pay the broker for that information, and you don't have to sign an exclusivity agreement with a broker for that information. You can talk to a broker and just say, hey, I'm interested in looking at space, and I was wondering if you could tell me what your thoughts are on, spaces that have been leased recently by organizations similar as ours, and how much have they paid, and, like, what's the going rate right now as opposed to 2 months from now. But I just want to reinforce, you don't have to sign an exclusivity agreement or pay them for that information. And there's a number of times when you can talk with 2 or 3 brokers to kind of, get their thoughts. And also it's a great way for you to kind of get a sense of the professionals and see which one ultimately seems like it would be a good fit for you if you have a property that you want to pursue and feel like you need a broker. The second thing is there's an awful lot of information on the web about commercial properties and what they're leasing for. And so usually, if you just do a Google search of commercial properties and then the geography that you're looking for and look for prices, it's not going to be perfect. And I do think in general, brokers' information is better on this. But it can give you enough information that you can ask some meaningful questions. Like, you say that, but then I see this property is on the market for this amount per square foot. Like, what do you account for the difference to be? And just listen to, what the answers to those questions are. But it's a question of informing yourself to make sure that you're educated and can evaluate, someone like a broker's advice to you.
Thank you, Lisa. I see another question coming in about what advice would we have if the charter authorizer is the landlord. A great question. I think go back to the know your landlord and know the property, and kind of to elaborate that on 2 fronts. One is, are you in good standing with your authorizer, who is also your landlord? And, are they, hopefully they're rooting for you to succeed. But also, are they the owner, or are they the landlord? In other words, we don't have context through this question about whether they, outright own the property, or they somehow assume the master lease on this property as a result of, the vacancy of another school. But understanding what their positions and interests are, and, paying the costs associated with the property. Would be important information to have. Knowing that we just have a few minutes left, I want to try to get to a couple other questions. Lisa Holtzmiller, there's a question, what % fee does it typically take to negotiate termination of an at-market lease that does not have a termination clause?
I mean, that's not an easy, that may not be the right one for me. It's very difficult, and it just all depends on the market that you're in. And if there's someone, if your landlord has someone willing to come in, or they know that they're going to be able to lease this property again quickly, then I think you have a much better shot at getting out of a lease. But in this climate, I think any termination is going to be a hard sell to a landlord, because they are just as uncertain as schools are right now in what comes next. So yeah, I would welcome Sarah or Lisa if you have additional thoughts on that.
I would just add, I had experience with a situation like this, last year pre-COVID, in that, there was a school closure taking place. There wasn't necessarily a termination, specific termination clause in the lease, but there were many other interested schools, and it was a single landlord, a family-owned property that, was a kind of income-producing property. They weren't looking to sell the property, so they were simply just interested in releasing, and they were really just open to, if there was a tenant who could assume the lease without any detriment to the existing, lease terms, they were willing to, to give the same terms. And, that was a favorable outcome for both the school exiting and the school entering. And so I think it depends on your situation and whether or not, there might be other schools in your market, who would have an interest in your space. One other question that I'll field to either Lisa D or Lisa H from Matt Newberg. Is the square footage restricted to the building? In our case, we have grounds and outbuildings like greenhouses, a sugar house, a 1 acre farm. I want to go there.
I want to go to your school.
How do you put these into the value of the lease? Lisa D, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, you know, Lisa H, you can chime in too. I guess I would see this as like you probably have different prices per square foot for the different components of the property. So for example, you know, if there's a core instructional building, like that might have a value of one price per square foot based on the other comparable uses of other space like that. And then if you have other ancillary buildings, you know, my guess would be like the value of leasing a greenhouse is not going to be the same as the value of, you know, instructional space or kind of commercial space. And so my sense is that, you know, there's a blended square foot, but it's going to be a combination of like what, you know, a core instructional building might be that could be leased out for like general commercial purposes, and then these other kind of specialty uses. And so you probably get a blended square foot rate that kind of pulls them all in together. I don't know, Lisa H, what would you say?
No, I agree. I mean, I think it also depends on your landlord and how your landlord, you know, what's important to them. Maybe these other spaces really have no use without the building, and so they're willing to just throw them in for a really low cost. It doesn't seem like many people might be able to rent a 1 acre farm right next to a school. But again, I think it's
right.
dependent, but your approach is a good one.
Yeah. Great. Thank you both. One question left here. I think we may have addressed this one, but if your current lease is expiring, what's a good duration for the next lease, number of years? I think I would draw back to some of the considerations that were raised in our earlier conversation about it really depends on your situation, your market, and this sort of delicate balancing act between, you know, short-term kind of budget constraints and long-term kind of space and square footage needs, given that none of us quite know yet how long COVID will be with us and whether that will require significantly more space for the education of students as an ongoing concern. You know, typically, you know, in a good market with an established school, you're looking for as long a lease term as you can, you know, secure if you're not planning on moving. But otherwise, you might be trying to, you know, common lease terms might be around 5 years, 5 to 10 years. Anything else you all would add before we close up? Great, thank you. Mark, I want to turn it over to you. We're really grateful for everyone who joined us today. Hope that this conversation added some insights to your planning and preparation, and our emails are shared on this last slide, and a recording will be made available. We're happy to have any of you reach out with additional questions.
Thank you so much.
Sarah. Thank you, Lisa and Lisa. As Sarah just mentioned, check back on our website in about within 48 hours, and the webinar should be posted by then. We'll have 2 more webinars scheduled this summer in July, tentatively scheduled for the 8th, a webinar on short-term lending and long-term lending, which decision to make during uncertain times. And in August, I think we'll have one on the reopening process for your school facility. Please sign up and follow us. We have our website. We have a LinkedIn group. If you have requests for future webinars, feel free to send me an email. And as Sarah just mentioned, the panelists are happy to take any questions concerning this topic. So thank you again, everyone, for joining the Charter School Facility Center at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And please have a safe day and take care of yourself. And in the words of Stephen Drubner of Freakonomics, if you can, take care of someone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.